The historic repeal of Roe versus Wade was one of the most significant victories in the history of the pro-life movement. However, that victory does not mean the end of the challenge for pro-lifers. In fact, paradoxically, the victory at Roe versus Wade has probably made the 2022 election one of the most important elections in the history of the pro-life movement. And even if that election goes the way pro-lifers might hope, the work isn't over, it's just beginning. In this episode, I'll take a deep dive into what we need to do as pro-lifers and members of the pro-life movement in the next couple of months, and then the next couple of years, so that we can turn the victory from Roe versus Wade into a major step forward for the pro-life movement. And I'll also outline how if we don't do what needs to be done, it could actually turn out to be a step back. I'm Dr. Nolte, and this is Blind Politics. And welcome once again inside the American One Studios in Hampton, Virginia. I am Dr. Nolte, and this is Blind Politics. I am an assistant professor of government at Regent University's Robertson School of Government. Please remember, you can rate and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast provider for the audio podcast. But for the video podcast, we please ask you to check out our YouTube channel or also go to American One, that's American and the number one, your one-stop shop for conservative news, commentary, sports, and other cultural products are coming as well. And once again, views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of either Regent University or the Robertson School of Government. So I did a previous episode talking about what life after Dobbs is going to look like for the pro-life movement. But I want to expand on that because a couple of things have become evident as we move forward. When I recorded that previous episode, I basically said, we don't really know what the political effects of this are going to be. I would stand by that with one caveat. There's one thing that we do know, and that is this. In the 2022 election cycle, pro-choice, the most zealous pro-choice voters have been mobilized. We can see this in some of the special elections since Dobbs, and some of the abortion referendum in Kansas plus Dobbs. We now have enough data to say that there's a pattern. And that pattern is college-educated white women who are wealthy and don't go to church are turning out at high numbers to protect other people's rights to abortion, because of course they're not going to have abortions themselves, but it's very important for them to come out and vote on this issue, right? And so here's the challenge that I think we need to look at from a pro-life perspective. Why are these people doing this, right? Why are these particularly zealous advocates of abortion coming out? And here's where things get a little bit sticky in terms of understanding the motivation and what it means. Because their motivation isn't self-interest, okay? These are not people who are protecting their right to an abortion. Because most of them wouldn't necessarily get an abortion. Abortion rates among that cohort that is the most motivated by abortion are very low, okay? Abortion rates tend to be the highest among people who are more low income, okay? Now, you could say it's a self-interested thing in terms of, there have been people who've made arguments in the past that essentially Democrats are using abortion as a form of welfare reform, right? They want to make sure that there are fewer poor people so that it costs less to provide the safety net. I don't necessarily buy that argument because I don't think that actually the motivations here are that cynical. I think that unconsciously that might be some of what's happening, but I don't actually think there's that much cynicism. And if there was that much cynicism, this response wouldn't be what's happening. I think the motivation here is that this cohort of voters has convinced themselves, or has been convinced, that the right to an abortion is essentially necessary for women's rights. Okay, so they believe that for women to have any rights at all, you have to have the right to an abortion. Now, we might say that that's illogical, because it is. That makes no logical sense whatsoever. Right? Abortion disproportionately affects baby girls if you look at the world as a whole. Abortion doesn't necessarily increase the value of women, right? So if you think of human life and human dignity ethic, that tends to be better for women, actually. And so it's not clear that abortion actually advances women's rights in any sense. It is only if you believe that women's rights essentially means the right not to bear children, that this makes any sense whatsoever. Okay? But whether we think it's logical or rational or not, that is the motivation. And here's where I say this gets a little bit sticky. Because when you have people that are motivated by essentially an irrational assumption or a belief, something that's not based in logic, but that is based in their feeling, right? That there's a sense of a violation of women's rights and violation on sort of a personal level, right? If they don't have the right to an abortion, they're not going to behave rationally, okay? They're not going to say things like, well, look, in the state that you're in, nothing's going to change. Okay, you have people in New York's 19th congressional district, right? It's very clear based on the results that a significant section of the Democratic base that turned out on this turned out because of abortion. The Republican was running on inflation issues, running on economic issues. The Democrat was running on all Dobbs all the time. The Democrat won in a very low turnout special election. That means that the Democratic base was motivated by abortion. Now, with Roe v. being repealed, what's going to change in New York? Absolutely nothing. Because New York already has a state law that says that abortion is legal until the moment the baby exits the birth canal. And what Roe says is states get to have their own laws. So if you're in New York, nothing is going to change. These are not people that are motivated by their own personal interests, right? They're motivated by an irrational but powerful belief that this is all about women's rights, and that if there isn't a constitutionally enshrined right to abortion, then it's going to be the Handmaid's Tale tomorrow. I mean, I think that this seems to be what they actually believe. Here's the problem with that. That type of irrational belief, if it is sufficient to motivate Democrats to the point that they actually hold the Senate or hold the House, then what are Democrats going to do in response to that? They're going to turn around and they're going to say, well, obviously this is what our base wants, so let's pass the law that we have proposed already to codify Roe versus Wade. Now, breaking this down a little bit. This is not a law to codify Roe versus Wade, whatever the Democrats might be saying. It is a law to make that law that I described in New York, that abortion law, the law of the land, right? As written, it protects not only the right to partial birth abortion, but would eliminate born alive laws that say that if a baby's born alive, then you have to provide care. It would, based on some of the laws that Elizabeth Warren wants to pass, they also want to attack crisis pregnancy centers, right? Which is basically any health clinic that provides women's health that doesn't provide abortion could technically, the way it's written, could fall under a crisis pregnancy center. Okay? And basically say if you won't provide abortion to refer people for abortions, then we're going to put you out of business. Okay, Democrats would rather women not have resources, not have availability for resources to help them if they're pregnant, than have people have the right to not refer for an abortion, right? They would rather have those people out of the healthcare business entirely than helping women. Right? You could see rationally somebody saying, well, okay, we want to have the right to have our abortion clinics, but if you want to do your thing, that's fine over here, right? You want to not refer people for abortions? No. If you're not willing to support abortion, they don't want you in the healthcare space, period, end of discussion. Again, this is not a rational calculation. These are not people who are doing policy, okay? These are not people who are following the science, right? They're not rational, logical in the reality-based community, because in the reality-based community, what you would say is, even if you're in a blue state where abortion is legal until the moment the baby exits the birth canal, at least it's better to have somebody providing these alternative services, ultrasounds, assistance to pregnant women, counseling referrals, parenting classes, things like that. It would be better to have people providing those services than not. And the more people that are providing services, the more women are going to get helped. Right? That's the rational pro-choice response. Okay? But this isn't rational. And this is what they want to pass. So this election, this 2022 election, is the most important election that pro-lifers have had in a very long time. Why is it that important? Because pro-life voters need to make sure that Republicans at least take the House. Because if that doesn't happen, then you're actually going to have a situation where Congress is going to pass laws that will eliminate many of the pro-life laws that are already on the books in your state. They will be wiped away. Now, there's going to be constitutional challenges. We don't know how that's going to play out in the Supreme Court. But that is essentially the direction that Democrats are going to go. And the message that it will send to Republicans is abortion is a losing issue from us. Right? If we talk about abortion, we're going to lose. That's the message Republicans would take from that. And if that's the message Republicans take, you can forget ever getting them to run on the issue again. Republicans are already like terrified of abortion, right? Republican politicians. Male Republican politicians are really bad talking about it, but Republicans in general they're terrified of it. They don't know how to talk about it. They don't know what to deal with it, right? They're pro-life because they have to be. Not necessarily many of them because they want to be. And certainly the political consultant class in the Republican Party is terrified of abortion. They would rather talk about the most unpopular economic policy they have 24 hours a week, 7 days a week than talk about abortion, even when it might benefit them politically to do so. Okay? So this election is not important for pro-lifers because of what we will accomplish if we are successful. By we, I mean the pro-life movement. In ideally having a high enough pro-life turnout that we take the House and also the Senate. That would be ideal. We're not going to get much done on the pro-life side at a federal level in the next 2 years. But that's not why this is important. This is important because it will stop bad things from happening. And so what if the pro-lifers actually do turn out? Republicans take the House, Republicans take the Senate. If Democrats run on this ultra-abortion stuff, a noun, a verb, and abortion all the time, and it doesn't work for them, that sends the opposite message. That sends Democrats the message, hey, maybe leaning into this abortion at all costs mentality is not actually going to work for us. Maybe we need to moderate our position. Maybe we're the ones who've overplayed this issue. And if we couldn't win in this environment after Dobbs, when we had people that were coming out of the woodwork in some of these special elections to vote on abortion, if we can't win on that, when are we going to win? And I will tell Republicans, you better not bend on this pro-life issue because they're the ones who just saved your majority. Okay? So it's very important for pro-lifers to turn out. You don't necessarily have to, I know for a lot of pro-lifers, it's hard to say, I'm going to vote Republican, right? You don't love the Republican Party. Maybe you don't agree with them on other issues. All right. And I'm not someone who's going to say just because you're pro-life, you need to vote Republican if you don't agree with them on other issues all the time. But I am going to say that now because Democrats have decided to make abortion the sole reason for their campaign. It's what they're running on. It's all they have left. It's the only bullet they have in the chamber. It is what they are promising to do. Okay. And so if you're a pro-lifer and you are not voting for Republicans in this election, that actually is going to set back the pro-life cause. I'm not saying you need to vote for Republicans forever, right? And if they don't deliver the goods, sure, don't necessarily give them your vote. But in this election, it's not about we need the Republicans to do a bunch of stuff. It's about we need the Republicans to stop things from happening. Because if that doesn't happen, then you're going to have legislation that's passed to do all of these things, and abortion essentially becomes a federal issue, where every time the Democrats take over, they're going to pass the same set of laws again, and it just becomes a political football, and this is going to get worse, not better. If we can stop them here in this election, what happens? That doesn't mean that we've won permanently, but it does mean that the abortion issue goes back to the states. From a constitutional conservative perspective, that's where it belongs. Roe was bad from a constitutional perspective, whatever your view on abortion. It was absolutely indefensible constitutionally. And if you look at the dissent from Dobbs, that becomes even more clear because they don't really try to defend it. Okay? So what happens? It goes back to the states. So step one for the pro-life movement. Win this election. Show up. Vote. Vote like the future of the pro-life movement depends on it, because I'm not going to say that it absolutely does, but it kind of does. Then the next step for the pro-life movement is We need to get our act together in terms of state policies. We need pro-life state policy networks. We need model legislation. And the model legislation should have this in mind. How do I move the ball forward in the state that I'm in terms of limiting abortion as much as is practical given the constraints of the electorate? All right, this is not we're going to ban abortion in every state without exceptions at all costs. That's not feasible. And it's not actually prudent. And the reason I'm going to say it's not prudent is because if you propose legislation on this issue that you can't get passed, then you convince the muddled voters who haven't been forced to think about abortion since 1973 as a policy issue and so don't know what they think about it. You're going to push those people in a more pro-choice direction. So we actually need to come out with legislation that is prudent, that is reasonable, and that is in accordance with what people in that state actually think, but that moves the ball forward in a pro-life direction. And that should be the goal in every state. Because if we're the ones coming out with rational, reasonable sounding policy prescriptions and we can say, look, here's this country in Europe that we can point to that has the exact same abortion regime, regulatory regime, as exists in the state that we live in. And then the Democrats are coming back with, oh, this is the Taliban. Okay, congratulations, Democrats. You just compared France to the Taliban. Good luck with that. Or Ireland, right? Or Poland. No one's buying that, right? So it's about positioning, it's about messaging, and it's about having state policy networks and state policy proposals that are on top of the game in every state, okay? So that what you're pushing is consistent with what people believe and that you're pushing it in a way that it wins people over, because that's how we win the fight in the long run. It's 50 small fights where we advance the ball on abortion in 50 different states, little by little, and just showing up how extreme our opposition's position is on this. And that doesn't mean that we're going to get to zero in every state, but it does mean that we're going to reduce the total number of abortions in every state, which means that we are saving lives. And by the way, I think it also means that we are helping women, because one of the components that should be a part of all of these legislative proposals, particularly in blue and swing states, is increased scrutiny and safety regulations and things like that on abortion clinics. Because as we know from the Gosnell case in Pennsylvania, sometimes there are absolutely no restrictions, no health codes, etc. And it's unsafe, and it's actually killing women, right? So not only are we saving the lives of the unborn, but we're probably also saving the lives of women themselves. And by the way, in ensuring that pregnancy centers have the rights and the freedom to operate, that means that more women are getting help. And that's a good thing. We should all be able to agree on that. We should all be able to agree that women's health is important, and that more providers in the field is a good thing, and that more safety is a good thing, and that if majorities support reasonable restrictions on abortion, that we should support that as well, okay? And that's the ground that we can fight on, because this has now become a policy issue. So we need to be smart, and we need to fight on that ground. I'll use an analogy here. The NRA isn't necessarily going to, or Gun Owners of America, if you prefer GOA, but they're not going to push for open carry in New York, right? What they're going to push for is this handgun ban that you have is not, that doesn't pass muster. What they're going to push for is, let's maybe change your concealed carry permit from a may issue to a shall issue, right? It's incremental change, but it's incremental change that moves in the direction of respecting the Second Amendment more. That is a model that the pro-life movement needs to follow in every state, okay? So Roe versus Wade getting repealed is a great thing. It's a positive step forward. I don't want to say that it's not. It is absolutely, from a constitutional perspective, a huge step forward, and it now allows pro-lifers, it gives us the space to make our argument in that policy space. But we cannot get complacent, and we cannot assume that just because Roe has been repealed that we have won the battle, because it's just starting. And actually, if we're not engaged in this election in particular, things are going to move in the opposite direction, and they're going to move in the opposite direction really fast because of the signals that will have been sent to the Democratic and Republican parties specifically, and because of the policy responses and the legislation that will come as a result of that. So if you're pro-life and you're hearing me today, get out there, get engaged, go vote, and look for the pro-life organizations that are actually setting up these networks, these policy networks in the different states. I know Susan B. Anthony List is working on this. I think there are other organizations as well. And help them, right? Help this to get better organized and get off the ground, right? To a certain extent, stepping back to a 30,000 foot level, to a certain extent as pro-lifers, right? We're kind of like the dog that caught the car. We've been so focused on getting Roe repealed and hoping and praying for that and marching for that and mobilizing for that because it was so egregiously bad. I think to a certain extent, in a lot of our minds, we never thought it was actually going to happen. And then it did. And so there's a little bit of this what now? And I wish that we had time to kind of bask in the awesomeness of people finally respecting the Constitution on this issue again, but we really don't, because the pro-abortion movement is mobilizing. They are turning out in some of these low turnout elections, right? And they, if Democrats hold the House and hold the Senate, they are going to say, this is because of abortion. The country's with us. Let's push as far as we possibly can on this issue, right? So if you're pro-lifer, if you care about this issue, if you're number one if this is your number one thing, you have to not let that happen. And so that is what's at stake in the short run and the long run. I'm not saying that it's unwinnable, but I'm saying we cannot get complacent. We cannot take this for granted. It's going to be a wrap for this episode. Please remember you can rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast provider. You can find us for video podcasts on American One. That's American and the number one. And also the Blind Politics YouTube channel has got some good stuff going there as well. You can find our audio podcasts on your favorite podcast provider, iTunes, Spotify, etc. Please give us a 5-star rating if your rating service has the ability to do that. And please tell all of your friends to check us out here at American One and also on the Blind Politics feed. So for Blind Politics, this is Dr. Nolte, signing off.